Tonight, we explore one of ancient Rome's more unusual professions, the orgy planner. Yes, someone actually had to meticulously schedule the wine, oversee the grapes, organize the entertainment, and ensure no one accidentally brought their mother-in-law. It might sound absurd, even outrageously decadent, but Roman feasting culture wasn't just about pure indulgence. It was a sophisticated interplay of power, social status, networking, and, well, quite a bit of nudity. So before you get comfortable, please consider taking a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I provide here. And do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps activate a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's unique journey together. Your eyes flutter open before sunrise, not due to discipline, but from sheer anxiety. You are the meticulously chosen planner for tonight's elite Roman orgy, which means your mind has already conjured 17 potential catastrophes before you've even had breakfast. Your sleeping mat is still warm, your tunic is frustratingly wrinkled, and someone has already slid a scroll ominously under your door. It crackles with foreboding. You unroll it with the grim resolve of a soldier reading his draft notice. It's from your patron's wife, who wishes to remind you that last time the rose petals were yellow, not red, and guests noticed. You haven't even had a bite of your barley. Outside, Rome is just beginning to stir, but you're already mentally juggling flaming amphorae. Today's guest list includes powerful senators, renowned artists, deep philosophers, two courtesans who notoriously despise each other, and rumor has it, someone from the imperial family. Of course, no one will tell you precisely who. It could be a distant cousin, or it could be Caligula. Either way, you will inevitably be blamed if someone's peacock isn't sufficiently massaged. You slide into your sandals and commence the day like any diligent Roman orgy planner, with a potent mix of dread and a trusty clipboard. First order of business, staffing. You dispatched runners yesterday to secure flute girls, dancers, a harpist, and that singular man who walks on his hands while expertly balancing a tray of figs on his feet. None have confirmed their attendance. You strongly suspect at least two are currently inebriated somewhere in the Subura district. Then there's the food. You've meticulously requested oysters, honey-roasted dormice, figs, dates, olives, and several rather questionable meats imported from the eastern provinces. Everything must arrive fresh, or at the very least, convincingly fresh-ish. One bad oyster, and half the forum will be whispering that you deliberately poisoned Senator Gaius. Oh, and do not, under any circumstances, forget the cushions. Last time, one of the divans collapsed under a toga-heavy magistrate, and the resulting fallout was decidedly political. This time, the couches must be sturdy enough to withstand whatever unfolds upon them, and you know precisely what is likely to unfold upon them. The sun has barely risen, and you're already perspiring into your linen tunic. You take a deep breath. You remind yourself, you are a professional, a maestro of delightful madness, a choreographer of controlled chaos. It's destined to be a long day, but rest assured, the cushions will be perfectly fluffed, the wine will flow, and the esteemed guests will never truly comprehend how close you came to outright screaming. Not yet anyway. It's still early, and already you're unrolling a fresh scroll. This is today's updated guest list. You read it slowly, mentally steeling yourself for disaster. It isn't merely a seating chart. It's a delicately balanced social powder keg, with olives precariously balanced on top. Lucius Calpurnius Piso is attending naturally. He attends everything and invariably insists on reclining on the central couch, ideally next to someone else's wife. The problem is, his wife, Aurelia, is also coming. She wasn't invited, but that has never deterred her before. You make a swift mental note. Separate couches, distinct wine sources, and absolutely no harp solos while they are both in the room. Last time she threw a garum jug. Next, Senator Petronius Arbiter has accepted. A witty man, a dangerous man, renowned for his sharp tongue, and not always in a poetic sense. You'll need to seat him far from Junius Blasus, whose poetry Petronius once famously described as a slow death written in meter. Then you spot it. Diocyanes and two guests unnamed. The vagueness is frankly insulting. Could be respected clients, could be gladiators, could be a giraffe in a toga. You write, flexible seating, West End, and move on. Now for the entertainers, 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, and the mime twins. That's already one more performer than Lucullus approves of. He considers mimes barbaric. His mistress, however, finds them delightful, and his reputation hinges on her approval. The guest list isn't merely a collection of names, it's a dynamic map of ancient Roman tensions. Politics, power struggles, lust, entrenched family feuds, and long-standing vendettas, all reclining together on silk-covered couches, drinking from the same communal bowl of wine. And of course, the true dread, someone important who wasn't invited. You can already anticipate the hushed accusations. It was intentional. Public insult. I'll never lend him my bath slaves again. You roll up the scroll, you draft a new one. You meticulously draw arrows, add urgent warnings, and circle key names. You're not planning a mere party. You're managing a live diplomatic simulation, complete with potent aphrodisiacs and roasted dormice. Still, you've done this before. You'll manage it again. You just hope this time no one stabs anyone over couch placement, unlike last spring. With the guest list finally ironed out, or at least stable enough not to immediately collapse, it's time for the next looming crisis: provisioning. Planning a Roman orgy isn't just about pouring wine and igniting torches. It's about curating a menu so utterly decadent it would make the gods feel underdressed. Your list already spans 3 wax tablets. Let's begin with the essentials: wine. Not just any wine. It must be Falernian, aged and expensive enough to make your patron wince slightly. You scrawl 3 amphorae Falernian, 2 of Cuban for show, 1 of vinegar to serve to the guests who arrive fashionably late. Next, oysters. Imported fresh from Baiae. They absolutely must be alive upon arrival, or at the very least convincingly moist. You dispatch a swift note to the seafood vendor, pointedly reminding him that last time, half the oysters were already deceased, and one guest declared it an ominous omen. He's still undergoing recovery from that incident. Then there are the honey-roasted dormice, a true staple of Roman decadence. Rolled in poppy seeds and generously dipped in honey, they must be plump, not stringy. You request 50, you'll be fortunate to receive 35, and half of those will still subtly twitch. You add roasted peacock, whole, feathers reapplied for dramatic effect, though it tastes like shoe leather, stuffed sow's udder, dates from Judea, figs from Carthage, and cheese wrapped in vine leaves. You also hurriedly scribble down a reminder: no garum accidents near the bread this time. The last event's anchovy-scented rolls nearly incited a riot. For dessert, you'll require candied nuts, almond cakes, and some form of visual spectacle, perhaps a cake shaped like the Colosseum, teeming with live songbirds. You'll worry about the baking logistics later. Then comes the vital perfume budget: myrrh, rose oil, saffron water, and enough incense to render a Vestal Virgin lightheaded. You make a critical note, discreetly scent the latrines. You stare at the comprehensive list. It looks more like a military requisition than a mere menu, and it will undeniably cost more than a respectable villa just outside Ostia. But this is Rome. Opulence is not just expected. Gluttony is a coveted style, and your patron's reputation hinges entirely on guests being too utterly stunned by luxury to notice that the music is slightly off-key and someone has spilled wine on the priceless marble lions. You hand the scroll to your fastest runner with stringent instructions. No substitutions, no apologies. And if he forgets the sugared grapes again, I'm feeding him to the flamingos. Time to invoke Mercury, god of commerce and swift delivery. Let's clarify something immediately. A vomitorium is not what you might assume it is. No, Romans did not construct specialized rooms exclusively for purging mid-feast to make room for more peacock. That's a persistent later myth, likely concocted by someone who observed Romans eating and couldn't conceive of any other explanation. The term vomitorium in reality refers to the entrance and exit passages in Roman amphitheaters, through which crowds spewed out after events. But that undeniable fact does little to curb modern imaginations from conjuring images of marble-tiled lounges for throwing up, replete with perfumed nobles and feather fans. That said, Romans certainly did overindulge, and if a guest discreetly excused themselves to step out and refresh, no one would ever question it. So as an orgy planner, it's your crucial responsibility to ensure the entire venue, from the elegant atrium to the opulent triclinium to every discreet garden alcove, is impeccably prepared to absorb the consequences of excess, all in impeccable style. You begin your meticulous inspection. The banquet hall floors must gleam. The mosaic tiles, especially the intricate section depicting Bacchus riding a panther, require a quick final polish. You personally remove a stubborn grape stem embedded in the grout from last week's gathering. You understand your exacting standards. The latrines are thoroughly cleaned, perfumed, and generously stocked with fresh sponges on sticks. The lemon vinegar solution is refreshed. A single candle burns gently near the doorway, not for illumination, but for an added touch of dignity. Out in the courtyard, you double-check the fountain basins. Guests possess an unfortunate habit of reclining too far and toppling in after their fifth goblet. Last time, a general's wife nearly drowned in the koi pond. You've since removed the koi. You cannot, however, remove the wife. You pass through the perfume room, where oils and salves are arranged like an apothecary of pure indulgence. Rose, cinnamon, myrrh. You sample one, and your wrist instantly smells like a love letter dedicated to Venus. Perfect. Next, you inspect the vomitorium myth room. That is, a quiet hallway discreetly concealed by a curtain, furnished with a comfortable chair, a polished bronze basin, and a polite slave stationed nearby with a fan. It's not officially called that, of course. It's known as the retreat, but everyone knows its true purpose, and it too must sparkle clean, scented, and luxurious. No matter how unrestrained things become tonight, no one will leave this party feeling undignified. If they do purge, they'll do it surrounded by polished marble and tasteful murals of satyrs. That is your unwavering promise. It's mid-morning, and it's time for the most delicate part of your job. Not the selection of rare wines, nor the intricate management of demanding nobles, but the crucial task of addressing the staff. A Roman feast of this colossal magnitude demands people. Lots of people. And none of them woke up today genuinely hoping to be an integral part of yet another nobleman's indulgent fever dream. You gather the entire team in the atrium, 23 individuals, each assigned a specific vital role. Most are slaves, some born into the household, others purchased specifically for the purpose of carrying trays, pouring wine, or simply looking aesthetically pleasing while remaining silent. A few are paid performers, all are palpably stressed. First up, the cupbearers. You assign them their designated zones, the central triclinium, the periphery lounge, the west garden. Dilute the strong wine unless told otherwise, you sternly remind them. Some guests believe they can handle full Falernian. They cannot. Fanbearers are next, a profoundly crucial role. Their timing can either ensure a guest's comfort or completely shatter it. One gust too strong and you've extinguished a candle or inadvertently exposed someone's secrets. One too weak, and someone will visibly perspire into a silk cushion. Neither is acceptable. Fruit attendants. Yes, they are indeed a designated role. They are instructed to refresh trays constantly, peel grapes only upon explicit request, and discreetly remove any fruit that begins to resemble a shriveled raisin. Then there are the musicians, already bickering incessantly about tempo. You promptly separate the flute girl from the lyre player. Last time their disagreement devolved into a duet so excruciatingly awkward that guests paused mid-feast to offer them marriage counseling. The dancers, all gleaming oil and dramatic eyeliner, lean languidly against a pillar, feigning disinterest, but clearly listening intently. You go through their cues anyway. No improvisation, you state sharply. We are absolutely not reliving the Bacchic fire incident. You make eye contact with the youngest slave, a boy no older than 10, whose sole responsibility is collecting discarded sandals. You nod once, he nods back. A silent, unwavering pact is made. He will not fail you. Finally, you deliver your usual concise speech. Tonight, you are invisible unless summoned. You are silent unless spoken to. You are grace, rhythm, and elegance incarnate. Or I swear by Jupiter, I will assign you to sponge duty until Saturnalia. There's a noticeable pause, then a collective, almost imperceptible nod. Briefings are complete. You take a calming breath. The intricate human engine behind this Roman debauchery is now oiled, powdered, and precisely aligned. For now, it happens every single time. The invitations are sent, the wine is delivered, the silk cushions are meticulously plumped, and just when you begin to feel a sliver of control, someone rushes into the atrium, breathless, with that all-too-familiar look. The musicians haven't arrived, of course. They haven't. You grit your teeth. You specifically booked a flute girl, two cithara players, and even one backup allos duo in anticipation of this exact situation. And yet, here you are, staring down the barrel of silence at a party where silence is considered a civic offense. You dispatch your most reliable runner to the Subura district, Rome's chaotic marketplace of noise, questionable aromas, and poor decisions. Find them, you instruct, alive, conscious, and dressed. You don't even bother to ask why they're late. You already know. They're either still fast asleep, too inebriated to walk, or entangled in a romantic escapade that commenced at last night's Saturnalia rehearsal and simply hasn't ceased. The dancers are now complaining vociferously that without musicians they cannot possibly rehearse. The poets, however, are absolutely delighted, assuming this predicament means more stage time for their verses. You swiftly quash that idea. No one desires Gaius's ode to his mother's third marriage recited at a party where people are indulging in sugared dormice. You quickly consider contingency plans. The house cook knows 2 songs on a cracked reed pipe. A nearby slave possesses a decent singing voice if kept well away from the wine. Worst case scenario, you'll simply hum in rhythm while someone shakes a jar of lentils. You fervently pray it doesn't come to that. Then, like ghosts emerging from a cloud of incense, the musicians appear, fashionably disheveled, vaguely apologetic, and faintly smelling of spikenard and questionable nocturnal choices. One of the flute girls is missing a sandal. The other looks as though she's had her heart broken by at least 3 senators. Still, they are here. You assign them their stations, one in the atrium, one near the main dining hall, one in the garden for ambiance. You emphasize no dramatic tempo shifts, no dirges, no impromptu solos unless someone is actually expiring. They nod, sort of. You exhale, crisis averted, for now. But you keep a watchful eye on the lyre player. He's tuning it slowly, lovingly, far too lovingly for someone who isn't about to ruin everything with an improvised love ballad. You make a mental note. Station him near the door, easy removal. If music is the very soul of the party, then seating is the absolute strategy. You're not just placing guests on couches, you're meticulously navigating rivalries, blossoming romances, and enough unspoken tension to potentially collapse an entire marble villa. The Roman triclinium, the classic 3-couch setup, technically accommodates 9 comfortably, but more realistically 7 if no one brings their pet leopard. You begin by sketching it all out on a wax tablet, muttering to yourself like a general planning a siege. The center couch, that's where the status resides, the summus locus, the place of ultimate honor. It is reserved for the guest of the highest rank. Unfortunately, 2 individuals believe they are that person, Senator Piso and Governor Crispus. Both assert their claim by birthright, marriage, and sheer, unadulterated self-confidence. You'll need to decide who gets the coveted top spot and who gets mildly poisoned wine. You also need to keep lovers near each other, but not too near, unless they are former lovers, in which case they must be separated by an entire bowl of olives and someone charming but profoundly boring in between. Then there are the seat fillers. Charming but utterly forgettable citizens who exist solely to maintain peace. You strategically place a wealthy equestrian next to a dramatic poet to absorb the impact. The equestrian won't comprehend the poem, and the poet will relish the attention. It's a perfectly symbiotic arrangement. You assign courtesans to strategic locations, near the lonely, the rich, or the recently divorced. You also assign 2 of them to the west side, not because it genuinely matters, but because it will undeniably bother Aurelia, and she needs something to complain about other than the wine temperature. Of course. You deliberately leave room for unpredictability. Someone will inevitably arrive uninvited. Someone will attempt to switch seats to make a grand statement. Someone will spill wine and demand a complete reshuffling. You leave a few empty cushions, plausible deniability, last-minute flexibility, and a designated spot for the poet to sulk if necessary. With the seating plan finally complete, you admire your work like a sculptor regarding his finished marble, knowing full well someone will inevitably strike it with a hammer before sunset. You roll up the scroll and hand it off with this stern instruction. Place name tags in wax, and for the love of Jupiter, don't let anyone switch them. You know they will, but at least you made the effort. If the orgy is a grand performance, then the kitchen is its frantic backstage arena, and it distinctly smells of fire, figs, and utter panic. By mid-afternoon, the entire household is a frantic choreography of controlled culinary chaos. The main cook, a former naval cook now transformed into a domestic warlord, is already shouting at a terrified assistant over the precise stuffing ratio for roasted dormice. You distinctly overhear the words, "Honey, poppy seeds, and I will personally throw you into the Tiber." Excellent. Everything is proceeding according to schedule. The main attraction tonight, a peacock, roasted whole, its magnificent feathers meticulously reapplied for dramatic flair. It looks magnificent, tastes somewhat like shoe leather, and is primarily served so that wealthy guests can boast about chewing something that once strutted like a diva. The kitchen is also preparing a pig that has been artfully stuffed with live birds. Yes, that is a genuine historical detail. You roast the pig, carve it open at the table, and to everyone's surprise, doves fly out. It's impressive, a little unsettling, and only mildly traumatic for the doves. Platters of figs, dates, and honey cakes line the counters. A pastry shaped like the Colosseum is currently being glazed. A slave accidentally nibbles a piece of it. He is promptly reassigned to continuous grape fanning duty. In one corner, someone is stirring a vast vat of garum, that infamous Roman fish sauce, concocted from fermented anchovies and the tears of anyone within sniffing distance. You loudly remind them to keep it well away from the bread. One garum-soaked loaf ruined last month's affair and ignited a 5-day feud between two prominent magistrates. Meanwhile, the wine storage is being meticulously arranged. Amphorae of Falernian for the most important guests, cheaper vintages for those who won't discern the difference. You ensure the amphorae are labeled subtly. You've been burned before, quite literally, by an angry consul with a surprisingly sensitive palate. Every corner of the kitchen hums with palpable tension. Platters are being polished, sauces reduced, meats larded, and pastry horns filled with mysterious contents. You are omnipresent, sniffing, tasting, directing. You're not just managing a meal, you're orchestrating an edible spectacle, expected to impress, intoxicate, and survive being hurled during an argument. As you stride past the oven, the head cook barks. "If anyone drops another dormouse, I'm feeding them to the peacock." You nod. Things are progressing well. You'd assume selecting a scent would be straightforward, but in ancient Rome, perfume is a profound statement, and tonight's orgy is no place for amateur olfactory choices. The guests won't just taste and see opulence, they must unequivocally smell it. The very air must reek of wealth, irresistible temptation, and the kind of unshakable confidence achievable only by those who regularly bathe in imported rose oil. So you descend into the storage chamber where countless tiny alabaster jars line the shelves like sacred relics. Myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon oil from Ceylon, saffron from Cilicia, and an experimental blend cunningly named Essence of Nile Lotus, which smells suspiciously like an expensive pond. You've sniffed every single one twice. You begin composing the fragrance strategy like a meticulous battle plan. The atrium will exude citrus and cedarwood, sharp, fresh, a clean opening note. The main triclinium, that's reserved for heavier scents, myrrh, frankincense, a subtle touch of musk. It should subtly whisper, "You might make a mistake tonight," and that's perfectly acceptable. The private garden alcoves, where secrets will be exchanged and togas strategically misplaced, receive the most seductive blend, rose, cinnamon, and just enough spikenard to make someone momentarily faint if they linger too close. Then there are the perfumed oils for guests' hands and feet. You assign an attendant to warm them slightly. No one desires cold oil. Cold oil is for barbarians. Warm oil is for seduction and ensuring good lighting. And yes, you've meticulously scented the latrines too. You are certainly no barbarian. You instruct your staff, don't over-scent. We desire luxury, not suffocation. If a senator walks in and attributes his nosebleed to the aroma, we have undeniably overdone it. One of the dancers requests a personal scent, something hypnotic. You provide her with a blend so potent it once instigated a minor riot during a Saturnalia feast. You issue a stern warning. She smiles, knowing she will use it regardless. You glide through the halls, trailing your nose like a highly trained hound. The atmosphere is beginning to bloom. Warm, spiced, opulent. A perfumed breeze wafts through the triclinium like a whispered secret. You nod. This is precisely what indulgence smells like. Perfectly scented, exquisitely lit, and fully armed with intoxicating aroma. The house is nearly ready to receive its guests. All it requires now is a touch of chaos. It's late afternoon. The air is thick with the scent of warm citrus, roasted meat, and very expensive decisions. You've assigned every single task, subtly threatened everyone necessary, and successfully bribed the harpist to remain sober until at least dessert. Now comes the moment of truth, the final walkthrough. You begin at the entrance, where oil lamps are being meticulously lit one by one. They flicker gently across polished marble, casting a golden glow that implicitly states, "You're not poor, not tonight." A flower boy sprinkles fresh petals at the threshold. You remind him not to overdo it. Last time, someone slipped on lavender and attempted to sue the household. In the atrium, the bronze fountains are flowing. Grapes are absurdly pyramided in impractical displays, and pillows have been beaten, fluffed, and positioned with an unnatural symmetry. You subtly shift one cushion to make it appear less staged. It's crucial that decadence feels utterly effortless, even if it has required 32 grueling hours and 2 minor emotional breakdowns to achieve. Next, the triclinium, the central event space. Tables are low, recliners are perfectly angled, and each cushion has been thoroughly dusted, perfumed, and strategically rotated to conceal any lingering wine stains from last month's senator's birthday disaster. You perform a quick bounce test, soft enough for comfort, firm enough to withstand vigorous activity. You inspect the table settings, gleaming silver goblets, polished bronze platters, exquisitely blown glass amphorae. Bread is artfully arranged, cheese is sweating slightly, but you decide it adds authenticity. You discreetly remove a beetle from a fig. No one saw it, it never happened. In the garden alcoves, the lighting is soft and ambiguously dim, just enough to be flattering, just bright enough to prevent accidents involving potted plants and one's dignity. A servant gently fans incense. The overall effect is ethereal. You pause and allow yourself to briefly savor it. You spot a small detail, a single flower out of place. You meticulously fix it. Another small detail, a curtain that isn't quite even. You adjust it. A final, comprehensive check. You inhale deeply, you listen. You walk through the space as if you were a discerning guest. It's beautiful, ridiculous, excessive, perfect. You sigh. For a fleeting moment, you allow yourself to believe it's all under control. Then someone rushes in. The guest of honor has arrived early, and of course, he brought 3 extra wives. You smile tightly, straighten your tunic, and step resolutely into the fray. The first knock isn't so much a knock as it is a dramatic thump, immediately followed by boisterous laughter. You take a deep breath. Here we go. The door swings open. A slave pulls back the curtain with just enough flourish to impress, but not overshadow the entrance of your first guest, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who strolls in as if he owns the entire establishment, despite not having paid for a single aspect of it. He emanates the sense of strong wine, pure ambition, and imported cologne that costs more than a soldier's annual wage. He greets you with a wide grin and a conspiratorial wink. "Tonight, my friend," he declares, "we make Bacchus blush." Trailing behind him is a procession of courtesans, a minor poet, and a man carrying a small lyre who may or may not have been invited. You decide not to verify. Guests begin pouring in, flowing robes, gold-threaded tunics, intricately embroidered sandals, and expressions of affected boredom. They've all arrived early to underscore their importance, and they've all clearly had at least one drink to demonstrate their relaxed demeanor. You mentally recalibrate the wine rations. A slave offers perfumed towels, another presents rosewater. One guest brusquely refuses both and instead demands a small amphora of something more Dionysian. You provide him with spiced wine. He labels it intellectual. You do not correct him. The garden fills with murmurs, introductions, subtle judgments, hushed conversations that are paradoxically louder than actual conversation. Someone has already inquired about the flute girls. Someone else is eyeing the fruit pile as if it owes them money. You keep moving, nodding, making subtle adjustments. You swiftly separate 2 senators who haven't exchanged words since the goat insult incident. You note that Governor Crispus is reclining far too intimately close to someone else's wife, and that the poets are congregating in a corner like storm clouds gathering. One of the dancers ventures too early into the center. You snap your fingers. Not yet, timing matters. If everything begins too soon, it loses its mystery. If it begins too late, guests complain. You desire suspense. You desire smoldering scandal. You pass a serving tray, discreetly pluck a grape, and continue walking. You spot one guest already snoring gently on a cushion. Another is polishing a dagger with butter. So yes, it's going well for a Roman orgy. Controlled chaos is the highest compliment, and tonight you're almost insulted by how smoothly it's unfolding. The lyres are tuned, the flute girls are finally sober, or at least adequately balanced, and the dancers are meticulously oiling their limbs as if preparing for battle. You give the definitive nod. The entertainment commences. A hush falls over the triclinium as the first dancer gracefully steps forward, golden veils flowing, anklets chiming, her eyes fixed somewhere between divine inspiration and complete apathy. She begins to move. It's graceful, hypnotic, and precisely the level of theatrical sensuality that makes elderly senators feel poetically inclined. The flute joins in, slow, spiraling notes that drift through the perfumed air like delicate incense. For a brief, beautiful moment, the entire feast falls into a collective rhythm. Chewing slows, conversations hush. Even the poet ceases his attempts to recite. But then, of course, something goes off script. A guest boisterously demands a reenactment of the myth of Leda and the Swan. Another counters, "No! Orpheus in the underworld, with real torches this time." A third suggests something involving naked gladiators, a water jug, and interpretive juggling. You smile politely and assure them it's all part of the plan. Meanwhile, the mime twins, who were explicitly instructed to wait until the third wine course, enter early and commence miming an exaggerated scene of seduction involving a fig and a sausage. Half the room erupts in laughter, the other half appears utterly perplexed. One man applauds as if it's a performance at the theater of Pompey. You resist the overwhelming urge to pour wine directly into your eyes. The dancers continue. The musicians valiantly attempt to adapt. You spot the harpist improvising something mournful, possibly because she's just realized she's playing in the wrong key. Then someone throws a peach. At first, it appears accidental, but then another guest retaliates with a fig. Now it's participatory. You swiftly step in, raise your hand, and declare it a symbolic offering to Bacchus. Everyone cheers, crisis averted. You make a firm note to never serve throwable fruit again. The entertainment surges forward. Music, movement, whispers, laughter. A flame dancer performs dangerously near the pool. A flute girl stumbles. A guest proposes marriage to a statue. It's glorious, perfumed, theatrical chaos. And this is precisely where you shine. Orgy planner, stage manager, mood wrangler, fig diplomat. You subtly adjust a lamp, nod imperceptibly to a server, and glide silently through the shadows as if any of this was your precise intention. By the third course, the wine isn't merely being served, it's being worshipped. The guests, draped across their couches like tipsy gods, are in full bloom, laughing too loudly, flirting too boldly, and completely forgetting basic facts like who they arrived with. You've instructed the servers to strategically dilute the wine. Falernian is potent. One amphora can persuade a senator to sing extemporaneous poetry or confess to tax fraud. You water down the wine for the overtly ambitious and leave it pure for the already hopeless. It's diplomacy by the jug. The conversations grow less philosophical and more intensely personal. A young patrician loudly compares his wealth to Jupiter's. A merchant boasts about owning 3 villas and a camel. A woman in pearls whispers a scandalous joke about the emperor's feet. You pretend not to hear her. If she gets exiled, you'll genuinely miss her. She's excellent with seating arrangements. Across the hall, a poet is attempting to seduce a philosopher using verse that sounds suspiciously plagiarized. You walk past just in time to hear, "Your eyes are like olives, dark and briny." You do not intervene. Meanwhile, 2 courtesans are locked in a passive-aggressive compliment battle. Each smile is a concealed dagger. Each laugh carries the faint scent of strategic murder. One subtly gifts the other a fig. You make a mental note, remove all figs by dessert. And of course, in the back corner, someone has decided to initiate a drinking game involving gladiator trivia. "Name 3 famous gladiators, or drink," someone shouts. A minor senator attempts to bluff his way through an answer. He is roundly booed. He drinks. He then collapses gently into a pillow and begins quoting Virgil. In the garden, a guest is delivering a speech. He believes he is being profound. He is in fact merely explaining how many slaves it takes to maintain a marble fountain clean. No one stops him. It's tradition. The wine flows faster now. Amphorae are opened like promises. Cups are never empty. Boundaries blur. Names are forgotten. Stories are exaggerated. The orgy part of the orgy is slowly, deliciously inching closer. And still, you diligently monitor the flow like a seasoned general. You adjust the lighting. You subtly slow the music. You intercept a guest attempting to drink perfume. The orgy is heating up, and the scandals? They're just beginning to simmer. By this point in the evening, the party has smoothly transitioned from structured decadence to unstructured, frankly mythological nonsense. Guests have entirely abandoned the use of proper names. Esteemed senators are now referring to each other as Apollo, Venus, or that guy with the peacocks. Someone has ingeniously fashioned a laurel wreath out of table herbs. You spot 3 people in the fountain. One appears to be attempting to baptize the others. You wisely decide not to ask. This is the precise moment where most hosts would descend into outright panic. But you? You calmly sip watered wine and begin quiet, strategic damage control. The gladiator wrestling reenactment has veered dangerously close to the mosaic of Neptune. You gently redirect them, offering a tray of dates as a timely distraction. It works. They fall for it like toddlers presented with shiny objects. You notice 2 guests are conspicuously absent. You locate them under a table, earnestly arguing about stoicism while rubbing each other's feet. You cough discreetly. They nod and feign searching for a lost bracelet. In the west alcove, the flute girl has burst into tears. A guest asked if her instrument was tuned, which she misinterpreted as a profound metaphor for something else entirely. You send over the backup lyre player and a complimentary handful of pomegranate seeds. She quickly recovers. In the atrium, a very large man is attempting to seduce a marble bust of Venus. He's whispering sweet nothings and slowly feeding it olives. You dispatch a servant to gently turn the bust away, hoping to avert a potential scandal. The man, however, perceives this as a challenge and immediately begins reciting passionate love poetry. You allow it. Frankly, it's preferable to his earlier conversation about grain tariffs. Someone knocks over a torch. You catch it before it ignites the tapestry. You do not flinch. You do not sweat. You are the calm, unwavering center in a storm of satin, grapes, and moral compromise. You navigate the room like a high priest of excess, adjusting, smoothing, redirecting. A subtle hand on a shoulder, a piercing look across the room, a raised eyebrow that unequivocally communicates, "Don't throw that goblet, Gaius." He puts it down. He knows better. This is your art, your controlled chaos, and you've tamed it just enough, but it's not over yet. You hear the distinct, alarming sound of someone riding a wine cart down the hallway. You take another sip. It's almost dawn. Dawn breaks with all the subtlety of a dropped amphora. Sunlight creeps across the marble floors, mercilessly illuminating the carnage. Overturned goblets, a sandal firmly stuck in a fruit bowl, and a nobleman sleeping face down in a decorative urn. The oil lamps are sputtering out. The perfume has faded into something vaguely resembling regret. You step carefully over a passed-out flute player and begin your final, meticulous round of damage assessment. The cushions are askew. Several togas are draped across statues in ways that could either qualify as avant-garde art or damning evidence. Someone has scrawled a philosophical limerick on the wall in wine. It doesn't rhyme, but it is surprisingly insightful. You make your way to the triclinium. A pile of olives has been crudely arranged into a likeness of the emperor. You consider preserving it, then quietly kick it under the table. The slaves begin the silent ritual of post-orgy cleanup. Wine-stained linens are bundled up, half-eaten peacocks are carted off, and incense ashes are swept into neat, dignified piles. You give instructions in a hushed voice, as though speaking too loudly might reawaken the deeper chaos. You check the guest list, everyone accounted for. No deaths, 1 sprained ankle, 2 spontaneous marriages, and 1 very polite note left by a departing philosopher that simply reads, "Thank you. I've learned things I must never speak of." You make a new list titled Debrief. It includes: never serve throwable fruit, do not allow live poetry battles near open flames, keep Venus statue in storage during future events, and seat Crispus far from anyone with legal representation. Someone groans loudly from under a table. You nod in acknowledgement but offer no assistance. The party is officially over. Everyone must now face their own consequences. In the garden, doves are still wandering from the pig burst performance. You gently herd them into a corner and throw them some leftover candied almonds. They deserve something sweet after the evening they've endured. You take one last look around. It was a glorious mess, a chaotic triumph, a diplomatic nightmare with grapes, and you survived it. You retire to your room, kick off your sandals, and collapse onto your mat. No applause, no awards, just the profound knowledge that no one witnessed the underlying chaos because you meticulously absorbed it all. Tomorrow, they'll tell grand stories about how utterly perfect it was. You'll just sleep. It began with a whisper of wind, dry, crackling, bitter. The soil of the Great Plains, once rich and black, had turned to powder. And now that powder took flight. Farmers who once danced in golden wheat fields stood helpless as their land, their very future, quite literally blew away. The 1930s were unforgiving to everyone, but for families from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and eastern Colorado, the land itself became the enemy. They had trusted the soil. That was the profound tragedy. Encouraged by government incentives and enticing promises of prosperity, thousands of families had relentlessly plowed up native grasses to make way for row after row of wheat. But they were never informed that those native grasses were the only thing truly holding the fragile land in place. And when the rain ceased in 1931, it did not return, year after agonizing year. The drought deepened relentlessly. Without deep roots, the topsoil had nothing to anchor it. It began to lift, carried away by the relentless wind in ever-thickening, ominous clouds. The storms arrived suddenly. One moment, the sky was a clear blue. The next, it was an inky black, as if night had abruptly fallen in the middle of the day. Walls of dust, hundreds of feet high, swallowed entire towns whole. Livestock suffocated, cars stalled, children developed debilitating dust pneumonia. Mothers desperately sealed windows with wet towels and stuffed newspaper into the cracks of doors. But the relentless dust still inexorably crept in, coating dishes, furniture, and lungs. People began to call it the Dust Bowl. On April 14th, 1935, a day forever etched in memory as Black Sunday, a storm of such colossal magnitude swept across the plains that some genuinely believed the world was ending. A preacher in Oklahoma reportedly instructed his congregation to go home and prepare for judgment. That storm stretched for over 200 miles, completely blotted out the sun, and transformed day into oppressive darkness for thousands. And with it came a chilling realization. They could not remain. The soil was gone, the crops were gone, the livestock were dying, children were literally coughing up dirt. What was once a land of fervent hope had become a desolate graveyard of dreams. And so, with battered pickup trucks, ramshackle jalopies held together with wire, and every meager possession strapped precariously to the roof, families turned west, toward California, toward survival, toward something, anything, better than this despair. They didn't yet know what awaited them on the other side, but they knew precisely what they were fleeing from, and it was relentlessly gaining on them. The road west was not paved with gold, it was paved with sheer desperation. As the Dust Bowl ravaged the plains, an exodus unlike any other in American history began. Families crammed into rickety Fords and Chevrolets, often with 4 flat tires and more children than available seats. Everything they possessed, mattresses, kettles, washboards, cherished heirlooms, was lashed down with coarse rope. Their destination was a distant dream, California. Route 66 became the vital artery of this escape. It stretched from the Dust Bowl states to the Pacific, winding through New Mexico, Arizona, and into California's sprawling Central Valley. For many, it wasn't just a road, it was a lifeline. Towns along the route swelled with desperate migrants. Makeshift camps sprang up near gas stations, and any rest stop with running water quickly became a temporary home. They arrived by the thousands. An estimated 2.5 million people fled the southern plains during the 1930s. Most were small-time farmers, sharecroppers, and field hands. They left behind mortgages they couldn't possibly pay, fields they couldn't save, and homes they could no longer inhabit. Many never looked back. Others wept openly as they crossed the state line. But California was not the promised land they had imagined. Newspaper advertisements had touted abundant farm jobs and lush, fertile fields, but the reality was far harsher. By the time most migrants arrived, the Great Depression had already choked off much of the economy. Work was scarce, and wages were far lower than what was required for mere survival. At the state border, California Highway Patrol officers began turning people away if they appeared too poor. Derogatorily nicknamed Okies, regardless of whether they were actually from Oklahoma, these migrants were viewed with profound suspicion and often outright hostility. Locals feared they would bring crime, disease, or worse, fierce competition for the few available jobs. Still, the travelers pressed on. In makeshift encampments cynically dubbed Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, whom many blamed for their dire plight, they slept under tarps and cardboard. In the fields, they picked peaches, grapes, cotton, whatever was in season. Their children toiled alongside them, often in the scorching heat. A day's meager pay might purchase a little bread, perhaps some beans. And yet, even through profound hunger and public humiliation, they clung to a tenacious hope. Hope that the next field would pay better, that California would eventually deliver on its elusive dream, that the long, dusty road, however arduous, truly led somewhere better. Because to turn back wasn't just impossible, it meant utter surrender, and none of them were ready to do that. Once in California, the dust may not have followed them, but the relentless hardship certainly did. For the thousands of families who arrived seeking a better life, what they found instead were crowded, unsanitary migrant camps and a cold, unwelcoming reception from the local populace. Entire communities of tents, shacks, and makeshift huts sprang up on the outskirts of towns and orchards. These were not homes, they were survival zones. Families crammed into shelters constructed from salvaged wood, tin scraps, cardboard, and canvas. There was little to no privacy. Water came from communal pumps. Toilets were often nothing more than rudimentary dugout pits, shared by dozens. Illness spread rapidly. Malnutrition weakened the old and the young. Babies cried for milk. Parents prayed for work. The air might have been cleaner than Oklahoma's, but the pervasive mood was still suffocating. Tensions simmered. Local Californians perceived the migrants as a grave threat. They feared that the relentless influx of desperate laborers would undercut wages, and they were, in this fear, correct. Growers could now offer mere pennies for backbreaking fieldwork, knowing that somewhere, someone would be desperate enough to accept it. And so wages plummeted, working conditions worsened, and exploitation became the tragic norm. Sometimes the migrants' only refuge came from the federal government. The Farm Security Administration, FSA, established a handful of meticulously organized labor camps, like the one in Arvin, California, offering sanitation, rudimentary medical care, and a semblance of basic dignity. These government camps were distinctly different, organized, clean, and even remarkably democratic. Residents elected their own committees and settled disputes internally, creating some of the only democratic spaces these families had ever known. But there simply weren't enough of them. Most families lived outside this slender safety net, in the informal, often lawless settlements that ringed the agricultural valleys. They were frequently harassed by local police, driven out of towns by angry mobs, or forced to constantly move to avoid detection. Local authorities frequently labeled them vagrants. Some children were outright denied schooling, others were too ill or too busy toiling in the fields to attend. And yet, even within these harsh camps, a powerful culture of resilience began to flourish. People played guitars around flickering campfires. They exchanged stories. They shared their meager food. They sang songs like Hard Traveling and Dust Bowl Refugee, giving voice to their profound pain and their unwavering perseverance. These were not just melancholic ballads. They were anthems of survival. Because even when life stripped them of their land, their homes, and their security, they clung fiercely to community. And with community came strength. They were poor, but they were not broken. And slowly something profound began to grow amidst the hunger. Solidarity. For the children of Dust Bowl migrants, childhood was not a time for carefree play. It was a daily exercise in sheer endurance. Their toys were often mere sticks. Their games played in dusty lots beside roadside camps, and their classrooms were sprawling fields of crops. The Great Depression had already strained America's youth, but for these children, poverty came with an extra layer of suffocating dust and constant displacement. They were not shielded from the pervasive struggle. They were an integral part of it. Even very young children worked tirelessly alongside their parents, stooping to pick cotton, grapes, or beans for a few meager cents a day. Some were as young as 6, their small fingers blistered and raw by the end of each grueling shift. School was an unimaginable luxury. Constant relocation meant constant interruption. By the time they enrolled in a new school, it was often time to move again. And if they managed to attend school at all, they were frequently unwelcome, labeled as Okie kids. They were mocked by their peers, and sometimes even by their teachers. Their clothing, patched, sun-bleached, and often shared between siblings, instantly marked them. Their accents, their dust-bitten skin, their silence born of pervasive hunger, all set them apart. Some schools outright refused to enroll them. Others required them to clean toilets before being permitted to attend class. Yet, amidst such profound adversity, these children developed an uncommon grit and resourcefulness. They learned to care for younger siblings while their parents toiled in the fields. They carried heavy jugs of water to the laborers, mended broken shoes with scraps of rubber, and helped stretch meager meals made of beans, cornmeal, and lard. Despite the overwhelming odds, there were small, precious triumphs. Relief agencies occasionally provided books, soap, and even makeshift schools in the rare government camps. With a modicum of stability, children could laugh, read, and learn, if only for a brief while. It wasn't much, but for a child who had endured relentless dust storms, gnawing hunger, and constant homelessness, it was a beginning. Some grew up to remember these years not just as times of deprivation, but of profound togetherness. Families, though impoverished, were tightly knit. Storytelling, music, and shared chores forged bonds that lasted lifetimes. The children might not have possessed toys or celebrated birthdays or enjoyed summer vacations, but they had one another. And as they matured, many carried that fierce resilience into adulthood, becoming the first in their families to secure stable jobs, complete high school, or join the military in the looming war. They were children of dust, yes, but also children of unyielding determination. As the Dust Bowl migrants toiled in California's fields and camps, their poignant stories did not simply vanish. They transformed into song. Music became both a profound comfort and a powerful weapon, a way to preserve dignity and protest injustice when words alone proved insufficient. In the evocative rhythm of guitar strings and the raw verses of folk ballads, the pain, pride, and unwavering perseverance of the migrants came vibrantly alive. Nowhere was this more vividly apparent than in the music of Woody Guthrie, an Oklahoman native himself. Guthrie became the unmistakable voice of the displaced. He traveled alongside migrants, slept in the same squalid camps, and picked crops in the very same fields. What he witnessed, he sang. His songs were not abstract. They named real places, real struggles, and real heartbreak. Dust Bowl refugee, for example, soberly warned hopeful migrants that California was not the paradise they had naively imagined. California is a Garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi. Guthrie's songs echoed through dusty camps, played on battered guitars, harmonicas, or simply sung aloud. They were passed from tent to tent, worker to worker. These were not just melodies, they were living oral history. They reminded listeners they were not alone. They transformed shared pain into collective strength. But Guthrie was not the sole voice. Across the camps, migrants created their own songs about lost farms, cruel foremen, the arduous road west, or their fragile hopes for a better tomorrow. These songs spoke the unvarnished truth when newspapers wouldn't, when politicians wouldn't. They articulated the bitter realities of exploitation, hunger, police harassment, and shattered dreams, but also of enduring love, unwavering faith, and tenacious resistance. This music deeply influenced the burgeoning American folk scene and became part of a larger cultural shift. It exposed listeners beyond California to the harsh realities of life for Dust Bowl refugees. It cultivated empathy. It subtly planted the seeds of activism. Over time, these songs helped fuel support for reform. They humanized statistics. They pierced through indifference. They challenged the prevailing narrative that the migrants were lazy or unwanted. In melody, they proved otherwise. Because when the land failed, and the work was cruel, and the people were hostile, there was still the music. It nourished souls when bodies starved. It gave voice to the voiceless. and it reminded every man, woman, and child beneath a canvas roof, you matter, you belong, you endure. The migrants possessed their songs, but they also found a powerful voice in literature, one that would resonate far beyond the dusty camps and sun-baked fields. That voice belonged to John Steinbeck, a California native who personally witnessed the Dust Bowl migration firsthand and transformed the profound plight of the displaced into one of the most powerful novels in American history, The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939. The Grapes of Wrath meticulously followed the fictional Joad family from Oklahoma as they undertook the harrowing journey west and confronted the brutal realities of migrant life. But while the characters were fictional, their suffering was agonizingly real. Steinbeck had traveled extensively through migrant camps, spoken intimately with families, and documented their lives in searing detail. He was outraged by what he observed: widespread malnutrition, rampant police violence, systematic wage theft, and the relentless erosion of human dignity. His words were not gentle, they were raw, furious, and unflinching. He vividly described babies starving to death, men breaking under the weight of humiliation, and women performing backbreaking labor while desperately concealing pregnancies. Steinbeck did not romanticize the poor, he profoundly honored them. He recognized in them a fierce resilience that stubbornly refused to die. The novel ignited a firestorm upon its release. Some critics condemned it as un-American. Growers and local officials vehemently denounced Steinbeck, accusing him of gross exaggeration and libel. One California Chamber of Commerce even publicly burned copies of the book. But readers across the country simply could not look away. Suddenly, the faceless Okies had names, stories, and beating hearts. Steinbeck's work did more than merely raise awareness. It forcefully pushed for tangible action. His rigorous reporting, combined with the immense influence of The Grapes of Wrath, helped pressure the federal government to launch investigations into labor abuses and to significantly improve conditions for migrants. It drew critical national attention to a crisis many preferred to ignore. And just as importantly, it preserved a vital record. Long after the camps vanished and the winds finally settled, Steinbeck's story remained. For the children and grandchildren of the Dust Bowl migrants, it became a touchstone, irrefutable proof that what their families had endured truly mattered, that their immense struggle had been seen. In a time when the poor were largely expected to suffer in silent obscurity, the Grapes of Wrath shouted. It demanded that the nation listen, and listen, many did. Because sometimes the most powerful form of resistance isn't a protest sign or a rallying song, it's a story. And Steinbeck told it like no one else could. As the Dust Bowl migrants streamed into California and the American public began to grasp the sheer scale of the disaster, the federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was compelled to act. The suffering was simply too visibly widespread to ignore. Children were starving, camps were overflowing, fields were filled with desperate laborers, and America's cherished image of itself as the land of endless opportunity was unraveling in real time. Enter the New Deal, Roosevelt's sweeping series of programs designed to rescue the country from the depths of the Great Depression. While the New Deal didn't miraculously solve every problem migrants faced, it undeniably marked a crucial turning point. Agencies like the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration, FSA, were established to offer desperately needed aid, restore dignity, and attempt to implement long-term solutions. The FSA in particular focused intensely on the profound plight of displaced rural families. It constructed government-run labor camps in California and other states, structured communities with clean water, proper toilets, medical care, schools, and even playgrounds. These camps weren't luxurious, but to families who had slept in ditches and roadside tents, they were veritable sanctuaries. Residents elected their own leaders and handled disputes internally, creating some of the only democratic spaces these families had ever known. The camps also evolved into vibrant cultural havens. There were libraries, music events, and even classes in English and farming. For many, they were places where a new kind of rural American identity began to take shape, one that profoundly valued self-governance, solidarity, and pride. Outside the camps, the New Deal offered jobs through programs like the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, although these were often challenging for transient migrants to access. But one of the most lasting contributions came not in dollars, but in powerful documentation. Under the FSA's direction, a team of photographers, including the renowned Dorothea Lange, was dispatched to capture the raw human cost of the crisis. Her haunting photo, Migrant Mother, instantly became an iconic symbol of Dust Bowl-era suffering. It gave the faceless a face. It gave the ignored a voice. Still, not all relief efforts successfully reached everyone. Racism, bureaucratic red tape, and local resistance frequently excluded the very people who most desperately needed help. Yet for many families, the New Deal wasn't just a policy, it was a vital lifeline. It was irrefutable proof that the government at last was genuinely trying to listen, and for once, help arrived before it was truly too late. By the late 1930s, many Dust Bowl migrants were no longer simply surviving, they were actively organizing. Years of relentless exploitation, broken promises, and dehumanizing labor conditions had pushed them to a tipping point. What began as quiet grumbling in the fields swelled into a powerful movement, a wave of strikes, boycotts, and labor protests that swept through California's agricultural valleys as migrants courageously demanded better wages, safer working conditions, and basic human dignity. It was a dangerous gamble. Growers were immensely powerful. They possessed significant wealth, political connections, and the full support of the local police. Striking workers were frequently arrested, brutally beaten, or forcibly driven out of towns. Some were blacklisted from future employment. Others were violently attacked by hired enforcers. But despite the profound risks, the workers stood their ground. Organizations like the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union, CAGU, and the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, PA, began to emerge, offering a rare but absolutely essential support system. Though often underfunded and fragmented, these unions helped teach workers how to negotiate, how to protest peacefully, and how to meticulously document abuses. For many migrants, especially women, joining a strike wasn't just about money, it was fundamentally about finding their voice. Mothers marched with children cradled in their arms. Teenage daughters stood resolutely beside fathers on picket lines. In some camps, entire families were evicted for daring to unionize. Yet their courage remained unwavering. In 1933 and 1934, massive cotton strikes erupted across the San Joaquin Valley. Thousands walked off the job, while growers attempted to break the momentum with intimidation and outright violence. The strikes gained national attention, and after long, arduous weeks of protest, workers secured a modest pay increase. Irrefutable proof that resistance could indeed work. Journalists and writers meticulously documented these uprisings. Photographers captured iconic images of tired but profoundly defiant pickers. Labor organizers like Luisa Moreno and Dolores Huerta, though their most famous work would come later, stood on the shoulders of these early migrant movements. The Dust Bowl refugees were not just impoverished, desperate people. They were political actors, resilient survivors, fierce fighters. Even as their accents marked them as outsiders and their humble clothes betrayed their poverty, they steadfastly refused to be silenced. They were no longer merely victims of weather and economics, they were now actively shaping the narrative. In standing up for themselves, they began to change not just their own lives, but the very future of labor in America. And their fight was only just beginning. By the early 1940s, the worst of the Dust Bowl had finally passed. Rain at last returned to the parched plains. The economy, significantly bolstered by the immense demands of World War II, began a robust recovery. Many migrant families who had once wandered desperately from field to field found permanent homes, steady work, and a fragile but precious sense of normalcy. But the migration had already left a deep, irreversible mark on American society, culturally, politically, and emotionally. The children who once picked fruit under a blazing sun grew up to serve with honor in the military, attend college through the transformative GI Bill, and raise families of their own. Some became farmers again, this time with a far greater respect for conservation and the fragile land. Others moved to burgeoning cities like Los Angeles and Bakersfield, laying the foundation for working-class neighborhoods that still thrive today. Culturally, the Dust Bowl migration profoundly reshaped California. Once viewed as unwanted outsiders, Okies gradually became an integral part of the state's very fabric. Their music, language, and values blended with local traditions, giving rise to new genres like the Bakersfield sound in country music, famously popularized by artists like Merle Haggard, himself the son of migrants. The pain and pride of those years never truly vanished. They simply found new, powerful ways to be expressed. In literature, The Grapes of Wrath became a permanent fixture on American bookshelves, a poignant reminder of both the nation's capacity for cruelty and its potential for profound compassion. In politics, the Dust Bowl era helped fuel the nascent labor rights movement, spurred critical land conservation efforts, and fostered a broader awareness of the desperate need for a social safety net. The lessons were not merely historical, they were fundamentally environmental. The Dust Bowl starkly taught America the profound danger of abusing the land. Soil conservation districts were established, farming techniques were reformed, and ecological stewardship became a crucial national conversation. The deep wounds inflicted by reckless agriculture were slow to heal, but never forgotten. And perhaps the most enduring legacy was that of unwavering resilience. These migrants had confronted nature's wrath, crippling economic collapse, gnawing hunger, and outright hate. They had been spat upon, shut out, and brutally shoved aside. But they endured, they adapted, and they played an instrumental role in building the modern West. Today, descendants of Dust Bowl migrants still carry the powerful stories of hardship and grit, in dusty family albums, in faded old camp photos, in the raw, authentic chords of a Guthrie song. They remember, because the Dust Bowl wasn't just a disaster, it was a defining chapter of American identity, one written in dust, yes, but also indelibly etched in determination. Imagine a world with no paper, no books, no Google, just memory and voice. That was the stark reality for nearly all human societies for the vast majority of our existence, long before alphabets were painstakingly carved into stone or ink flowed onto parchment. Knowledge was preserved entirely in stories, songs, and spoken rituals. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of sharing information. It was the primary engine of civilization itself. In these societies, memory was a sacred duty. Stories weren't told merely for entertainment. They were the vital vessels of identity, law, morality, and even survival. Elders passed on creation myths, ancestral lineages, laws, customs, and taboos. Farmers learned precise planting cycles from seasonal chants. Hunters meticulously remembered terrain through rhythmic recitations. Parents taught children crucial life lessons through fables and parables. Everything essential, who we are, where we come from, how to live, was carried within the human voice. Because there was no written backup, accuracy was paramount. Oral cultures developed sophisticated memory techniques to meticulously preserve knowledge. Rhythm, rhyme, meter, repetition, these were not mere stylistic choices. They were powerful mnemonic devices. Stories possessed specific structures for a reason. Chants and epics were meticulously designed to be unforgettable. And they absolutely had to be. In a world where the past lived solely in minds and mouths, forgetting wasn't just a lapse, it was a profound cultural crisis. But oral tradition was never static. It was inherently flexible and responsive. Each retelling carried a pulse of the present, allowing a storyteller to subtly adjust a tale for a new audience or shift emphasis depending on the specific context. This inherent flexibility enabled oral knowledge to be both enduring and remarkably adaptable, a living, breathing archive. It wasn't stored on dusty shelves. It walked, talked, danced, and sang. Storytellers themselves wielded immense social power. In many cultures, they were revered figures. They weren't just performers, they were memory keepers, truth bearers. In some regions, they served as spiritual guides or political advisors. In others, they held the sole, weighty responsibility for preserving centuries of collective wisdom. Losing a master storyteller could effectively mean losing a nation's entire history. In the absence of written words, societies did not descend into ignorance. They discovered other ingenious ways to thrive. Oral tradition ensured continuity across generations. It stitched time together, connecting the dead to the living, the individual to the community, the past to the future. And in many corners of the world, it continues to do so even today. In the heart of West Africa, history literally walks and talks. It sings, it remembers, it lives vibrantly in the voice of the griot. a multifaceted figure who is at once historian, storyteller, musician, genealogist, diplomat, and spiritual guide. In societies stretching from Mali to Senegal to Guinea, griots have meticulously preserved centuries of collective memory without ever committing a single word to writing. The fundamental role of the griot isn't just cultural, it's absolutely essential. For the Mande peoples and others, griots are the revered keepers of oral archives, entrusted with the collective knowledge of clans, lineages, and entire empires. They possess an encyclopedic knowledge of who married whom, who fought which war, what treaties were painstakingly signed, and what profound legends lie behind every village name. A griot can recount a genealogy that spans dozens of generations, recited flawlessly and without hesitation. This is not casual storytelling. Griots undergo years, sometimes decades, of intense, rigorous apprenticeship. From a young age, they are meticulously trained to memorize thousands of lines of verse, master complex melodies on traditional instruments like the kora, and deeply understand the historical, political, and spiritual weight inherent in each and every word. Knowledge is passed down orally from master to apprentice, generation to generation. Griots frequently served at royal courts, advising kings and chiefs. When a ruler contemplated a major decision, whether to engage in war, arrange a marriage into a rival clan, or forge a new alliance, it was the griot who offered crucial historical precedent, gently reminding leaders of past mistakes or long-forgotten ancient promises. In this sense, griots are not merely entertainers, but profound moral anchors. Their vital role helps ensure continuity, legitimacy, and enduring wisdom in leadership. Even today, in the digital age, griots remain deeply influential. They perform at weddings, funerals, naming ceremonies, and significant national events. Their powerful stories remind communities of who they are and what immense challenges they have collectively overcome. Griots hold power through their voice, an extraordinary ability to preserve unity and identity across centuries of profound change. When colonialism threatened to erase African history by disregarding oral sources, griots stood as a living rebuke. They powerfully proved that memory could endure outside of paper, and that oral tradition was not primitive, but profoundly sophisticated. In fact, much of what we know today about mighty empires like Mali or Songhai comes not from colonial records, but directly from griots who never cease singing their histories. They are walking libraries, living time machines, and without them, vast stretches of African history would have irrevocably vanished. Thousands of years before the invention of compasses or GPS, the peoples of the Pacific Ocean were already master navigators. From tiny canoes, they meticulously charted one of the largest expanses of water on Earth, sailing from island to island across thousands of miles. They possessed no written maps, no explicit written instructions. Instead, they had oral tradition, a deep embodied knowledge passed from one generation to the next, preserved not in books, but in the very blood and bones of memory. At the heart of this tradition were the wayfinders, highly trained navigators who utilized the stars, ocean swells, cloud formations, bird flight patterns, and even the subtle color of the water to meticulously find their way. This knowledge wasn't guesswork. It was incredibly precise, rigorously tested over generations of epic voyaging. But it wasn't written down. It was memorized through chants, songs, and vivid visualizations, taught over many years in sacred training contexts. One of the most famous examples of this oral memory system is the star compass used by Polynesian navigators. This mental map divided the horizon into specific points aligned with the rising and setting of stars. Each star held profound meaning, direction, and seasonal timing. Wayfinders would chant these stars in a specific sequence, imprinting entire navigational routes into their minds like a living GPS. The knowledge didn't stop with astronomy. Navigators memorized sequences of islands, detailed stories of past voyages, intricate ocean swells, seasonal winds, and even the oral genealogies of their own lineages. This was crucial because navigation wasn't solely about travel, it was deeply intertwined with identity. To sail the ocean was to metaphorically trace the steps of your ancestors, to renew your profound connection to them with every single voyage. Oral tradition also safeguarded crucial cultural history. Myths of great migrations, origin stories, and the heroic deeds of legendary seafarers were recited with immense reverence. These tales weren't just entertainment. they were vital survival manuals. They told when and where to travel, where fresh water could reliably be found, what dangerous reefs to scrupulously avoid, and what omens to heed. When European explorers arrived in the Pacific, they marveled at the astonishing accuracy of these navigators. Some initially dismissed their knowledge as mere luck or instinct. But centuries later, modern researchers began to rediscover the immense cognitive sophistication underlying it. Today, Polynesian voyaging societies are actively reviving these ancient oral traditions, training new generations in the intricate art of wayfinding without relying on modern technology. Because in Polynesia, to remember is to navigate, to speak is to sail, and to forget is to be irrevocably lost at sea. Long before the written word firmly established its place in Greek culture, bards traveled from town to town reciting epic tales that would come to define Western literature. Among these masterful storytellers was a name that has echoed through millennia: Homer. Whether he was a single historical figure or a composite of many voices, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey stand as towering testaments to the enduring power of oral tradition. These weren't simply static stories. They were dynamic, living performances, recited aloud, often accompanied by the lyre. Homeric epics were meticulously transmitted from bard to bard, memorized in their sprawling entirety. The Iliad alone contains over 15,000 lines of verse. How could one possibly remember it all? The answer lies in the ingenious architecture of oral composition: formulaic language, strategic repetition, and characteristic epithets like rosy-fingered Dawn or swift-footed Achilles. These frequently repeated phrases weren't just poetic flourishes. They served as powerful memory aids, crucial cues meticulously embedded within the narrative to help the performer maintain their flow. This method of oral composition allowed for inherent flexibility. No two recitations were ever precisely identical. A bard could expand or shorten the story depending on the audience, skillfully weaving in local heroes or emphasizing different emotional beats. In this way, oral tradition allowed the epics to remain relevant, continually reshaped by each generation, even as their core narrative remained intact. Homeric epics were far more than mere entertainment. They were profound moral instruction, historical memory, and a cornerstone of collective identity. Through the compelling stories of Troy and Odysseus, Greek audiences absorbed vital lessons on honor, loyalty, cunning, fate, and the unwavering will of the gods. The performances profoundly bound communities together, reinforcing shared values and reminding listeners of their integral place in the rich tapestry of myth and memory. Even after the revolutionary invention of writing, Homer's works continued to be performed aloud for centuries. The Greeks eventually committed the epics to text, but by then, they had already indelibly left their imprint on Greek thought, education, and religion. They became foundational cornerstones of classical learning, recited in schools and echoed in the works of philosophers and playwrights. The very survival of Homer's tales is a resounding triumph of the oral world. They weren't etched in stone, yet they endured longer than many civilizations themselves. They serve as a powerful reminder that human memory, when meticulously nurtured and carefully structured, can rival the permanence of books. Because in ancient Greece, to recite Homer wasn't just to tell a story, it was to hold history within your very breath. Long before European contact, the indigenous peoples of North America had built rich, complex civilizations without the aid of written language. Their histories, intricate laws, cosmologies, and scientific knowledge were preserved entirely through oral tradition. For these communities, the spoken word was not merely a method of communication, it was a sacred force. Stories were not just told, they were profoundly shared, passed down like ceremonial objects with immense reverence and a deep sense of responsibility. Each nation, whether the Haudenosaunee, Lakota, Navajo, or Hopi, possessed its own unique oral systems, meticulously suited to its particular landscape, cosmology, and social structure. Creation stories explain not just how the world began, but how humans were meant to live harmoniously within it. Animal fables taught crucial values like respect, courage, and humility. Historical narratives meticulously preserved records of migration, warfare, treaties, and contact with outsiders. These stories were often recounted during winter, when families gathered in longhouses or around fire circles, powerfully reinforcing shared identity and kinship. The storytellers, often elders or spiritual leaders, were chosen not just for their exceptional memory, but for their impeccable integrity. They had to be exact. Embellishment wasn't encouraged unless it served a specific ritual purpose. Many stories adhered to strict patterns, sacred sequences, and proper openings. A story mistold wasn't just inaccurate, it was profoundly disrespectful. Beyond history and myth, oral tradition also preserved crucial practical knowledge. Indigenous fire ecology, sophisticated agricultural systems, precise astronomical tracking, and complex herbal medicine were all passed orally across centuries. The knowledge of when to plant, where to hunt, how to interpret the stars, or what plants healed wounds, this wasn't written in manuals. It was spoken from elder to youth, often in the form of story, song, or ceremony. Even diplomacy was deeply rooted in oral memory. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one of the world's oldest participatory democracies, relied on the meticulous oral recitation of its great law of peace, an epic constitution preserved through wampum belts and ceremonial speech, not parchment. When European colonists arrived, they often dismissed oral culture as inherently inferior, not realizing they were conversing with societies possessing deep intellectual and legal traditions. In many communities today, that spoken world resiliently survives despite centuries of forced assimilation and deliberate cultural erasure. Indigenous elders still pass on songs, names, and profound wisdom. Some tribes are actively revitalizing endangered languages by reviving ancient storytelling ceremonies, recognizing that when a language dies, stories die with it. But as long as a voice remains, memory survives, and through it, nations endure. Long before holy books were bound in leather and reverently placed on altars, the sacred moved powerfully through speech. In nearly every major religious tradition, the earliest teachings were conveyed not on fragile scrolls, but within the human voice, recited, meticulously memorized, and carefully preserved by devoted followers. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of communication in these faiths, it was the very vehicle of revelation. Take Hinduism, for example, one of the oldest continuous religions on earth. The Vedas, Hinduism's foundational texts, were transmitted orally for centuries before ever being committed to writing. Sanskrit priests, known as pandits or Brahmins, were trained from childhood to memorize vast volumes of text, down to every precise syllable and subtle intonation. The Vedas were not merely words, they were believed to be sacred sounds holding cosmic power. Accuracy was absolutely essential. A mispronunciation could distort the spiritual effect. And so oral recitation was treated with unparalleled precision, rhythm, and reverence. In Islam, the Quran is considered by believers to be the literal, unadulterated word of God as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, not written, but recited. Even today, millions of Muslims meticulously memorize the entire Quran, a profound practice known as becoming a hafiz. The oral tradition here isn't a mere supplement to the written text, it is absolutely central. The melodic cadence of Quranic recitation, meticulously passed from teacher to student, sustains profound spiritual meaning and intimately connects the listener to centuries of unbroken transmission. Christianity also began as an oral tradition. The stories of Jesus, the parables, the early miracles, they were all shared aloud in gatherings before the Gospels were ever written down. Early Christian preachers traveled from village to village, speaking to crowds, debating, converting. Even after the New Testament was compiled, most congregants couldn't read. Faith was still primarily heard, not read. Psalms were sung, sermons were preached. Scripture vibrantly lived in ears before it ever reached eyes. In Judaism, oral tradition forms the very backbone of rabbinic teaching. The Mishnah and Talmud, foundational texts of Jewish law and interpretation, were initially preserved through complex oral chains of transmission. Rabbis debated and discussed teachings aloud, often committing thousands of lines to memory before anything was committed to ink. Across faiths, oral tradition ensured that the divine remained living, dynamic, spoken, and sung. Even today, believers continue these practices. Scripture is chanted, prayers are recited, mantras are whispered. Because for the faithful, the sacred isn't just what's written, it's what's heard, it's what's remembered, and it lives vibrantly within the human breath. Long before modern courtrooms and intricately printed legal codes, communities across the world upheld complex systems of law entirely through oral tradition. Justice wasn't dispensed by reading from a static book. It was spoken, meticulously memorized, and actively performed. In these societies, legal knowledge was a living memory, meticulously carried by elders, chiefs, judges, and councils, who ensured that fairness, obligation, and punishment were remembered and respected. Among the Gaelic Brehons of Ireland, justice was entirely oral for centuries. The Brehon laws, a detailed and intricate set of legal principles governing everything from complex land disputes to abstract honor debts, were transmitted by highly trained legal scholars who memorized thousands of verses and precedents. These judges didn't carry books, they carried an entire legal legacy. They recited decisions with precise language, carefully referencing past judgments and often utilizing poetic forms to aid memory and preserve consistency. In sub-Saharan Africa, many societies relied on elders and councils to enact justice through robust oral systems. In the Igbo, Zulu, or Ashanti traditions, legal matters were resolved in public gatherings where testimony was spoken aloud, witnesses recounted events, and judgments were issued through community consensus. The absence of writing did not imply a lack of structure. Memory was the law, elders were the living archives, and the spoken word held full authority. Similarly, indigenous communities in North America utilized oral justice systems to resolve conflicts and maintain harmony. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy relied on condolence ceremonies and consensus-based decision-making, guided by the Great Law of Peace, a constitution transmitted orally and reinforced through wampum belts, which served as beaded mnemonic tools. Laws were often embedded in stories, myths, and metaphors, powerfully reinforcing values like reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. These oral systems were not rigid. They were remarkably adaptable. They could evolve with changing times, seamlessly incorporating new realities without needing to revise written codes. This inherent flexibility made oral law dynamic, deeply embedded in community life, and often more restorative than purely punitive. When colonial powers forcibly imposed written legal systems, many oral law traditions were regrettably dismissed as primitive or inferior. But they were anything but. They were deeply community-centered, historically informed, and meticulously designed to maintain social balance, not merely to enforce state power. Today, some of these oral legal systems are actively being revived and honored. In places like New Zealand and Canada, traditional justice models are being thoughtfully integrated into formal systems, not because they are quaint, but because they demonstrably work. Because in oral law, justice isn't something you read. It's something you hear, something you remember, and something your entire community profoundly understands. At the very heart of every oral tradition lies a human being, the storyteller. More than just a narrator, the storyteller is a skilled performer, a dedicated teacher, and an indispensable guardian of cultural memory. Whether standing before a royal court or sitting intimately by a village fire, they expertly use voice, gesture, rhythm, and raw emotion to transform ancient memory into a vibrant, living experience. In oral societies, storytelling isn't just an act. It's a meticulously crafted art form with inherent structure, rigorous training, and profound purpose. Memory is the storyteller's greatest tool, but this isn't memory as most people typically understand it. Storytellers often train from childhood, absorbing tales word for word, gesture for gesture, tone for tone. They learn through extensive apprenticeship, attentively listening to masters for years before ever daring to tell a story themselves. Precision is paramount. The wrong detail can twist a sacred myth or gravely misrepresent a lineage. And yet, a crucial flexibility is also an integral part of the craft. A master storyteller knows precisely how to adjust timing, tone, or content to suit different audiences, specific moments, or prevailing emotional atmospheres. Across cultures, performance is central. In Japan, rakugo performers sit on stage with only a fan and a cloth, yet brilliantly bring entire casts of characters to life through subtle changes in pitch, nuanced facial expressions, and impeccable timing. In India, the Kathakali tradition masterfully combines dance, mime, and song to powerfully retell ancient epics like the Mahabharata. In West Africa, griots utilize instruments like the kora to accompany their recitations, effectively transforming history into captivating melody. Storytelling, then, is not static. It is dynamic theater, with memory as its intricate script. The audience is never passive in oral cultures. Storytelling is a deeply communal experience. Listeners gasp, laugh, respond actively. They are often familiar with the tales, but they come to hear them again, because how they are told matters as much as what is told. A familiar myth can feel new, fresh, even profoundly revelatory, depending entirely on the teller's skill. Importantly, storytelling is not solely for entertainment. It is simultaneously education, history, ritual, lore, and a crucial tool for survival. A story might teach a child which plants are poisonous. It might encode complex directions across a vast desert or impart essential rules about kinship and taboo. Often the lesson is subtly buried in metaphor, fully understood only with maturity. The storyteller is thus a cultural cornerstone. When they speak, they echo generations. They don't just remember the past, they embody it. Because in oral tradition, memory doesn't reside in books, it lives vibrantly in people. And when they speak, entire civilizations speak with them. In a world increasingly dominated beyond history and myth, oral tradition also preserved crucial practical knowledge. Indigenous fire ecology, sophisticated agricultural systems, precise astronomical tracking, and complex herbal medicine were all passed orally across centuries. The knowledge of when to plant, where to hunt, how to interpret the stars, or what plants healed wounds, this wasn't written in manuals. It was spoken from elder to youth, often in the form of story, song, or ceremony. Even diplomacy was deeply rooted in oral memory. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one of the world's oldest participatory democracies, relied on the meticulous oral recitation of its great law of peace, an epic constitution preserved through wampum belts and ceremonial speech, not parchment. When European colonists arrived, they often dismissed oral culture as inherently inferior, not realizing they were conversing with societies possessing deep intellectual and legal traditions. In many communities today, that spoken world resiliently survives, despite centuries of forced assimilation and deliberate cultural erasure. Indigenous elders still pass on songs, names, and profound wisdom. Some tribes are actively revitalizing endangered languages by reviving ancient storytelling ceremonies, recognizing that when a language dies, stories die with it. But as long as a voice remains, memory survives, and through it, nations endure. Long before holy books were bound in leather and reverently placed on altars, the sacred moved powerfully through speech. In nearly every major religious tradition, the earliest teachings were conveyed not on fragile scrolls, but within the human voice, recited, meticulously memorized, and carefully preserved by devoted followers. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of communication in these faiths. It was the very vehicle of revelation. Take Hinduism, for example, one of the oldest continuous religions on earth. The Vedas, Hinduism's foundational texts, were transmitted orally for centuries before ever being committed to writing. Sanskrit priests, known as pandits or Brahmins, were trained from childhood to memorize vast volumes of text, down to every precise syllable and subtle intonation. The Vedas were not merely words. They were believed to be sacred sounds holding cosmic power. Accuracy was absolutely essential. A mispronunciation could distort the spiritual effect. And so oral recitation was treated with unparalleled precision, rhythm, and reverence. In Islam, the Quran is considered by believers to be the literal, unadulterated word of God as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, not written, but recited. Even today, millions of Muslims meticulously memorize the entire Quran, a profound practice known as becoming a hafiz. The oral tradition here isn't a mere supplement to the written text. It is absolutely central. The melodic cadence of Quranic recitation, meticulously passed from teacher to student, sustains profound spiritual meaning and intimately connects the listener to centuries of unbroken transmission. Christianity also began as an oral tradition. The stories of Jesus, the parables, the early miracles, they were all shared aloud in gatherings before the Gospels were ever written down. Early Christian preachers traveled from village to village, speaking to crowds, debating, converting. Even after the New Testament was compiled, most congregants couldn't read. Faith was still primarily heard, not read. Psalms were sung, sermons were preached, scripture vibrantly lived in ears before it ever reached eyes. In Judaism, oral tradition forms the very backbone of rabbinic teaching. The Mishnah and Talmud, foundational texts of Jewish law and interpretation, were initially preserved through complex oral chains of transmission. Rabbis debated and discussed teachings aloud, often committing thousands of lines to memory before anything was committed to ink. Across faiths, oral tradition ensured that the divine remained living, dynamic, spoken, and sung. Even today, believers continue these practices. Scripture is chanted, prayers are recited, mantras are whispered. Because for the faithful, the sacred isn't just what's written, it's what's heard, it's what's remembered, and it lives vibrantly within the human breath. Long before modern courtrooms and intricately printed legal codes, communities across the world upheld complex systems of law entirely through oral tradition. Justice wasn't dispensed by reading from a static book. It was spoken, meticulously memorized, and actively performed. In these societies, legal knowledge was a living memory, meticulously carried by elders, chiefs, judges, and councils who ensured that fairness, obligation, and punishment were remembered and respected. Among the Gaelic Brehons of Ireland, justice was entirely oral for centuries. The Brehon laws, a detailed and intricate set of legal principles governing everything from complex land disputes to abstract honor debts, were transmitted by highly trained legal scholars who memorized thousands of verses and precedents. These judges didn't carry books. They carried an entire legal legacy. They recited decisions with precise language, carefully referencing past judgments, and often utilizing poetic forms to aid memory and preserve consistency. In sub-Saharan Africa, many societies relied on elders and councils to enact justice through robust oral systems. In the Igbo, Zulu, or Ashanti traditions, legal matters were resolved in public gatherings where testimony was spoken aloud, witnesses recounted events, and judgments were issued through community consensus. The absence of writing did not imply a lack of structure. Memory was the law, elders were the living archives, and the spoken word held full authority. Similarly, indigenous communities in North America utilized oral justice systems to resolve conflicts and maintain harmony. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy relied on condolence ceremonies and consensus-based decision-making, guided by the Great Law of Peace, a constitution transmitted orally and reinforced through wampum belts, which served as beaded mnemonic tools. Laws were often embedded in stories, myths, and metaphors, powerfully reinforcing values like reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. These oral systems were not rigid. They were remarkably adaptable. They could evolve with changing times, seamlessly incorporating new realities without needing to revise written codes. This inherent flexibility made oral law dynamic, deeply embedded in community life, and often more restorative than purely punitive. When colonial powers forcibly imposed written legal systems, many oral law traditions were regrettably dismissed as primitive or inferior. But they were anything but. They were deeply community-centered, historically informed, and meticulously designed to maintain social balance, not merely to enforce state power. Today, some of these oral legal systems are actively being revived and honored. In places like New Zealand and Canada, traditional justice models are being thoughtfully integrated into formal systems, not because they are quaint, but because they demonstrably work. Because in oral law, justice isn't something you read, it's something you hear, something you remember, and something your entire community profoundly understands. At the very heart of every oral tradition lies a human being, the storyteller. More than just a narrator, the storyteller is a skilled performer, a dedicated teacher, and an indispensable guardian of cultural memory. Whether standing before a royal court or sitting intimately by a village fire, they expertly use voice, gesture, rhythm, and raw emotion to transform ancient memory into a vibrant, living experience. In oral societies, storytelling isn't just an act. It's a meticulously crafted art form with inherent structure, rigorous training, and profound purpose. Memory is the storyteller's greatest tool, but this isn't memory as most people typically understand it. Storytellers often train from childhood, absorbing tales word for word, gesture for gesture, tone for tone. They learn through extensive apprenticeship, attentively listening to masters for years before ever daring to tell a story themselves. Precision is paramount. The wrong detail can twist a sacred myth or gravely misrepresent a lineage. And yet, a crucial flexibility is also an integral part of the craft. A master storyteller knows precisely how to adjust timing, tone, or content to suit different audiences, specific moments, or prevailing emotional atmospheres. Across cultures, performance is central. In Japan, rakugo performers sit on stage with only a fan and a cloth, yet brilliantly bring entire casts of characters to life through subtle changes in pitch, nuanced facial expressions, and impeccable timing. In India, the Kathakali tradition masterfully combines dance, mime, and song to powerfully retell ancient epics like the Mahabharata. In West Africa, griots utilize instruments like the kora to accompany their recitations, effectively transforming history into captivating melody. Storytelling, then, is not static. It is dynamic theater, with memory as its intricate script. The audience is never passive in oral cultures. Storytelling is a deeply communal experience. Listeners gasp, laugh, respond actively. They are often familiar with the tales, but they come to hear them again because how they are told matters as much as what is told. A familiar myth can feel new, fresh, even profoundly revelatory, depending entirely on the teller's skill. Importantly, storytelling is not solely for entertainment. It is simultaneously education, history, ritual, lore, and a crucial tool for survival. A story might teach a child which plants are poisonous. It might encode complex directions across a vast desert or impart essential rules about kinship and taboo. Often the lesson is subtly buried in metaphor, fully understood only with maturity. The storyteller is thus a cultural cornerstone. When they speak, they echo generations. They don't just remember the past, they embody it. Because in oral tradition, memory doesn't reside in books, it lives vibrantly in people. And when they speak, entire civilizations speak with them. In a world increasingly dominated by screens, complex algorithms, and vast cloud storage, it might appear that oral tradition has receded into the background. But in truth, it's not fading, it's actively evolving. The digital age, far from erasing spoken heritage, has paradoxically provided it with new platforms, wider audiences, and renewed power. Memory, voice, and story are once again central, not just in ancient rituals, but in podcasts, spoken word poetry, fleeting voice notes, and viral videos. The medium has undeniably changed, but the fundamental human impulse remains the same: to remember through the power of voice. Social media, ironically, has brought us full circle back to something ancient. TikTok creators craft modern parables in 60-second bursts. YouTubers revive ancient myths and engaging folktales for millions of viewers. Podcasts have become the new campfires where people gather through headphones instead of hearths to hear stories that move, teach, or entertain. And in many indigenous and marginalized communities, digital tools are now being powerfully utilized to record elders, revive endangered languages, and meticulously archive oral history before it is irrevocably lost. Technology is also profoundly empowering cultures that were once ignored. Smartphone recordings of grandmothers telling ancestral stories or children learning tribal songs are now being shared across continents. Entire archives of oral knowledge are now stored online, searchable and shareable. What was once confined to a single storyteller's memory can now be accessed by thousands with the simple press of a button. Yet this raises important questions. What happens when oral tradition is effectively frozen into a digital file? Can a recorded story carry the same raw energy, subtle nuance, or spiritual weight as a live, interactive performance? Will future generations still truly know how to listen, respond, and feel a story in their bones, not just hear it with their ears? The digital world grants oral tradition a new kind of permanence, but it also perhaps detaches it from the living, breathing exchange that once profoundly defined it. A story told face-to-face carries gestures, raw emotion, pregnant silences, and the palpable presence of community. It is shaped by the mood of the room, the age of the listener, the time of night. Can a story truly still breathe in a digital archive? The answer may lie in a delicate balance. Oral tradition doesn't have to vanish in the face of modernity. It can blend with it. Podcasts can preserve memory. Live-stream storytelling can unite global audiences. What ultimately matters is not the format, but the underlying intention. Because as long as people speak and others listen, oral tradition survives, not as a mere relic, but as a vibrant, living bridge between the past and the future. And its next chapter is being written with voice, not ink. Tucked deep within Egypt's western desert, beyond dunes that roll like endless waves and sun-bleached rocks that shimmer under a brutal sun, lies the Siwa Oasis. It is a place of improbable life and ancient mystery, a true mirage made real, surrounded on all sides by arid desolation. Here, cool freshwater springs, groves of date palms, and olive trees flourish where there should be none. But its true claim to fame isn't its unexpected beauty or its profound isolation. It's the divine voice that once echoed from its sands. Here, at this remote outpost near the borderlands of Egypt and Libya, stood the temple of the Oracle of Amun, a sacred sanctuary dedicated to one of Egypt's highest gods. Amun wasn't just a deity of the Nile. His influence spanned empires, merging with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. But Siwa's oracle wasn't merely a religious outpost. It was a spiritual beacon, a place where men came not to worship blindly, but to ask questions of fate and receive answers. Unlike the colossal temples of Thebes or Karnak, the temple of Amun at Siwa was modest in size, constructed from limestone and mud brick, weathered by centuries of intense heat and relentless wind. Its true strength lay in its profound silence and deep secrecy. The temple was nestled intimately within the town's sandstone cliffs, overlooking the vast sweep of the desert. It felt less like a grand monument and more like a hushed whisper from the divine, hidden, intimate, powerful. The oracle at Siwa was said to speak through the high priest, who would enter trance-like states during ritualistic ceremonies, delivering answers directly from Amun himself. Those permitted to approach the sacred shrine brought questions of war, succession, and identity. Not just common folk, but pharaohs and mighty conquerors journeyed across the blistering sands, seeking a glimpse of their destiny. What made Siwa truly unique was not just its extreme isolation, it was its remarkable independence. Though nominally part of Egypt, the oasis existed at its own distinct rhythm. Its inhabitants spoke a Berber dialect, and its priests were not mere tools of the state. They fiercely guarded the oracle with an impressive autonomy. The desert itself served as a formidable barrier, both literal and spiritual. To reach Siwa was a profound test of resolve, but to hear the oracle's voice was to receive something few ever did: certainty from the gods, or so it was believed. The oracle of Amun at Siwa was fundamentally different from other oracles. It didn't reside in the bustling cities of Egypt or the opulent temples of the Nile Valley. It existed in profound silence, surrounded by nothing but towering dunes and the haunting whisper of the wind. This very isolation imbued it with an almost mythical mystique and immense power. People genuinely believed that only in such profound stillness could the gods truly be heard. The rituals surrounding the oracle were cloaked in deep secrecy. The high priest, acting as the divine mouthpiece of Amun, would retreat into the inner sanctum, a sacred space where only a select few were ever permitted to enter. There, in a chamber heavy with thick incense and guarded by ancient stone walls, he would enter a trance-like state, his voice said to carry the undeniable weight of divine wisdom. Questions were posed in hushed tones, and the answers, once delivered, were obeyed without challenge. The answers themselves were often cryptic, shrouded in ambiguity, yet undeniably full of profound meaning. Like the Greek oracle at Delphi, the oracle of Siwa rarely spoke in direct terms. Its power lay in subtle suggestion, in offering profound direction without dictating absolute fate. But unlike Delphi, the Siwan oracle was also deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious cosmology. It wasn't merely a seer, it was a direct channel to a god who was also king. Pilgrims flocked from across North Africa and beyond, bravely enduring the merciless journey through the western desert to hear the oracle speak. Merchants, generals, tribal leaders, and even powerful kings arrived with offerings of oil, incense, and gold, fervently hoping for divine insight into the most difficult choices of their lives. Some came for deeply personal counsel, others arrived with questions that could literally determine the fate of nations. The oasis itself contributed to the pervasive mystique. At night, the desert grew impossibly quiet and dark, the sky a blanket of stars, and the wind rustling through the date palms sounded almost like hushed voices. Visitors frequently reported profound dreams, vivid visions, or sudden feelings of revelation after their visits. Whether by strict ritual or subtle suggestion, the experience left an indelible impression. But it wasn't just religious seekers who came. Shrewd political figures understood the oracle's immense value. To receive its divine blessing was to claim a unique legitimacy, not just among the local inhabitants, but across the entire Mediterranean world. A prophecy from Siwa could crown a king, justify a war, or even forge an empire. And soon, one man would test that very power, carrying with him a question no mortal had yet dared to ask. Was he a god or merely a king? In 331 BCE, a young, ambitious conqueror rode into the Egyptian desert with a crown already on his head and a burning question deep in his heart. His name was Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. By this point, he had already decisively defeated the Persian Empire and had been declared a pharaoh in Egypt. But mere titles weren't enough. Alexander sought divine affirmation, not from men but directly from the gods, and so he turned his gaze towards Siwa.